Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the science of chilling effects. I'm Katie Glenn Bass. I am the research director at the Knight First Amendment Institute. The Knight Institute defends the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age, and this is the second in a two-part series on chilling effects that we have put on this fall. The first of those was on litigating chilling effects, and we will put a link in the chat at some point to that video for those of you who would like to check it out. The reason we're doing this is because chilling effects is an important concept in First Amendment law, and it's also an important concept more generally for understanding whether people feel like they can actually exercise the rights that they have in the Constitution. So, for example, you may know that your right to protest is protected by the Constitution, but if you fear that showing up at a protest will subject you to surveillance or put you in the crosshairs of immigration authorities, you may not feel that you can actually exercise those rights. That fear is going to chill you from exercising your rights. So we wanted to dig in on that concept a little more on how you litigate that, and then also what science can do to help us understand chilling effects. And this particular webinar on the science of chilling effects grew out of conversations that I've been having for years with two of our panelists, Nathan Matias and John Penney, about the need for more discussion and more shared understanding between the legal field and social science. For social scientists, some of the things that we think would be helpful are hearing more about how litigation works and what kinds of arguments lawyers make about chilling effects, what kinds of scientific evidence might be useful to them. And then for lawyers, on the flip side, understanding more about how social scientists do their work, how they explore research questions, understanding more about what can be studied or what can be measured using scientific methods, and how to interpret the results that you get in a study, particularly for lawyers, maybe how to help a judge understand the results that are being put in front of them in a case. We've been having these conversations and trying to build these bridges for almost 2 years now. In January 2024, the Knight Institute co-hosted a workshop with Nathan and his Citizens and Technology Lab, which we called Platforms, Causality, and the Law, where we brought together about 30 litigators and social scientists to start having those conversations, start building those connections. And today's session grows out of that. Nathan will talk a little later on about another project that he is working on that also stems from that initial workshop. So we have three really excellent panelists to talk about these questions with today. I will introduce them now. Sarah Brayne is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Stanford University. In her research, she uses quantitative and qualitative methods to understand whether and how data-intensive surveillance shapes individual trajectories and population-level disparities. Her first book is called Predict and Surveil: Data, Discretion, and the Future of Policing. Nathan Matias is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University, where he founded and leads the Citizens and Technology Lab, which is a public interest research group that organizes citizen behavioral science and behavioral consumer protection research for digital life. He is also a former visiting scholar at the Knight Institute. And Jonathon Penney is an associate professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, where he holds the York Research Chair in Artificial Intelligence, Data Governance, and the Law. He's also the author of a new book called Chilling Effects: Repression, Conformity, and Power in the Digital Age, which is now available from Cambridge University Press. And early readers have raved about this book and called it definitive, myself included. It's really excellent. So before I kick off our conversation, I just want to explain for those of you who are watching, you can submit a question for any of the panelists at any point during the discussion in the Q&A box. I will try to keep an eye on that throughout the conversation and work in those questions, whenever it makes sense in the discussion. So please do ask whatever you would like to say. And if you'd like to include your name, you can, you don't have to. I will now turn it over to John to give us an intro to chilling effects in theory and in law, and then also how science has contributed to those theories so far. I will say, those of you who are with us for the first webinar, John joined us for that as well, and that's because John is one of the few people in the world who has a really good grasp on both the law of chilling effects and the science of it, so we're very fortunate to have him with us. John, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Katie. First of all, I wanted to say it's great to be back. It's so great for the Knight First Amendment Institute to be hosting these webinars. It's such timely and important subject matter. And it's great, of course, to be with these two excellent colleagues and panelists, Nathan, who I've collaborated with for a long time, and I know Sarah's work too, which I cite in the book. Some fantastic work in this area on the impact of surveillance. It's really great to be here. So I thought I'd begin with a little bit of foundation, so about the concept of chilling effects, and first give some concrete examples of what we're seeing unfolding today in society, and then think a little bit more about both the duality of chilling effects as a legal concept, and of course as a concept that can be explained and understood in terms of science and social science and behavioral science, which we'll be talking about. I know Nathan and Sarah will get into that later. So. Of course, when we think back and we take an account for the full year, for example, the first year of the Trump administration, there are just countless stories where you read through the news, where you have advocacy groups, civil groups, media reports, commentators, activists concerned about the chilling effect of different Trump administration activities. So take, for example, the administration's brutal immigration enforcement, like the ICE actions that really began in the spring, that targeted students like Mahmoud Khalil and Rumisa Öztürk at Tufts University. And when you distill these cases, really the aim here was to target speech that the Trump administration didn't like, right? So these were cases where they are engaged in campus activism, campus activities and advocacies, and the Trump administration really targeted them in order to chill and deter them, but not just them, others who might be encouraged to engage, were or would in the future, to chill those kinds of activities. And the way the Trump administration has gone about it is to really maximize fear, maximize uncertainty by weaponizing vague and overreaching laws, and also combining that and weaponizing powerful technologies, whether it's AI-driven surveillance, but also at the same time disregarding the First Amendment, disregarding due process, in a way that maximizes the impact, i.e., the chilling effect of these kinds of activities. And I don't think it's any coincidence that in those early ICE actions, the administration relied upon a 1950s McCarthy era statute, one that's vague, one that's overreaching, and that had in another era been used to persecute and to target and to chill supposed enemies of the state. But often the reasons behind those actions was to chill disfavored speech and to marginalize political opposition to the government. And I think that's a pattern that's repeated today. And you can see that across all kinds of domains where we're talking attacks on media, civil society groups, and law firms with a history of holding the administration accountable, or the FCC threatening media companies or over negative Trump administration coverage, or depression them into canceling shows featuring prominent Trump administration critics. And we can see the effects today. We can see campus protests in the ensuing months have been largely muted. We can see media companies have actually canceled shows and terminated contracts, and in some cases altered their coverage to be more favorable and positive. Law firms that have in many cases very well-resourced ones that led key lawsuits in the first Trump administration, now cutting deals and sort of sitting on the sidelines, and in some cases doing pro bono work for the administration as part of some of these deals. And you see civil society groups being very concerned about being chilled in their advocacy as well. So we can see this happening right before our eyes in society. How do we understand it? So what exactly are chilling effects? As I mentioned earlier in Katie's introductory remarks, they have this sort of dual character. On the one hand, chilling effects are a legal concept. They're part of what we might say chilling effects doctrine within US First Amendment law. But at the same time, chilling effects are a behavioral phenomenon that science can understand and science can describe. And I'll get into a little bit more later. I know Sarah and Nathan will as well. So let me start on the legal concept side, because it's important, because that's really where, at least in the modern era, this term comes to prominence, why we invoke it, why we talk about it, why we're using it in media and in government, but in particular in the law. So the concept comes to us in US First Amendment law. And its emergence comes in the post-war period, which is no coincidence because it's in the post-war period during the Red Scare of the McCarthy era. You have a series of really overreaching anti-communist statutes that are enacted during this period that are used to, at least ostensively, target enemies of the state, that is, alleged communists and their sympathizers. But in reality, and this has been documented by historians and social scientists over time, is that often the real aim was to suppress and to chill left-wing groups, whether it's labor unions, trade associations, um, uh, progressive and socialist political groups along the way. So that's the broader aim often with how these laws have been weaponized. And that continued then in the civil rights era, where these same McCarthy era laws were then repurposed in order to chill and to deter the civil rights movement itself. And in ways, we're seeing a similar pattern happening today. During this time, in those two eras, starting in the McCarthy era and then the civil rights era, the US Supreme Court issue a series of judgments where they're scrutinizing a lot of these overreaching and vague statutes, and they evoke this concept of chilling effects, to scrutinize these statutes, and in some cases, to strike them down. And the idea behind these judgments is that the laws are vague, and therefore people who may be engaged in First Amendment protected speech would self-censor, that they would be deterred or chilled from engaging in that protected speech for fear of being caught by the scope of the statute and facing some kind of legal punishment or harm. And so as a result of that, the fact that these laws could catch legally protected, constitutionally protected speech, the laws shouldn't be enforced and therefore struck down. So that's where the development of the doctrine begins. But as you can imagine, underlying that doctrine, underlying that idea, or the reasoning behind these judicial decisions, is a theory of human behavior, that these laws pose a kind of threat, a kind of harm or risk of harm, and that people in the face of that and in the risk of facing some kind of punishment, whether it's prosecution or persecution or surveillance by the state for engaging in disfavored speech or other kinds of activities, avoid the activity that is actually legal, is actually protected by the US Constitution, and are restrained and constrained from doing so. So how do we understand that kind of behavior? And that's the first way in which science really matters. And before I just get into that, one way that we can understand, again, the first way in which science becomes important is just understanding this phenomenon, right? This understanding and describing how this threat is understood by people and how we respond. So chilling effects are a behavioral response to a perceived threat to personal safety, whether that threat is real or imagined. And people self-censor and engage in forms of social conformity as a means of self-protection to avoid danger of that perceived threat. And conformity, too, is a mode of self-protection, something that I talk about in the book. Now, before I get into, again, more specifics of the science, why are we talking about this? What does it matter to speak of chilling effects? This is something also that science has helped us understood, because one of the ways in which I think we can best understand chilling effects is engaging the vast literature on behavioral and social theory. So understanding the impact of chill is something that can be demonstrated through social science. On an individual level, we can see in a lot of these cases that we're seeing unfolding before us in society, is that chilling effects on an individual level, of course, we lose valuable speech. We lose protesting speech, dissenting speech, creative speech, and innovative speech, where people are afraid of engaging in activities, engaging in speech, and avoiding it due to some kind of threat. Right? We lose self-creative expression and identity development, and often the impact of chill is very profound. And social science and behavioral science and other studies have demonstrated the impacts, how individuals through observational studies, through survey studies, and also through simply examples of people going out and speaking to victims that have been targeted by state and corporate processes and have been chilled, they explain how they've been affected by it. So one way in which science has been important already is understanding the effect of chill, how it affects people, their ideas, and how it chills individuals in this case. But another way that we can understand the impact of chilling effects on a societal level is also through science. And my own study on the impact of online surveillance and Wikipedia use, where I looked at people's behaviors in accessing privacy-sensitive content on Wikipedia before and after the Snowden revelations, I was able to demonstrate that this had a chilling effect. People were avoiding certain content on Wikipedia for fear that they might be caught up in some kind of mass surveillance operation, in some kind of dragnet that the government, and that they might be labeled deviant or some other kind of chill or impact. as a result of this online surveillance. And what that showed is a kind of chill that's not just on an individual level, but a broader societal level. And when you step back and you understand those kinds of effects, you can see how chilling effects due to surveillance, due to systematic weaponization of law and technology, the way we're seeing in society today, you can understand how this can lead to a broader climate of self-censorship, science, silence, and conformity. And that, of course, becomes a problem for democracy. For deliberative democracy, we lose dissenting speech, political opposition, and mobilization. We lose deliberative democratic activities, and we lose innovation and creativity, which, of course, has important implications for the vibrancy of society writ large. So already we can see in just understanding the impact of chilling effects, science matters. But it matters in other really important ways, too. Understanding, I guess, the phenomena, the factors that increase it, the factors that aggravate it, and then the factors that can be used to mitigate or resist it. So the best way, as I advocate in the book, to understand chilling effects is in light of the vast literature on threat response that likely has foundations in evolutionary psychology. So those who self-centered, engaged in conformity in response to a threat, in prior times were more likely to survive. So we had this very innate sense in the face of a threat that we would conform and avoid risks and threats as a means of personal safety. So we can be chilled on a conscious level, but we can also be chilled in the subconscious level as well. And that leads to forms of self-censorship, conformity, but also forms of institutional avoidance. I know Sarah's done fantastic work on this as well. And some of the factors I've talked about in my own research, drawing on that vast literature and combining it with some of the existing studies of chilling effects, is thinking through some of the key factors that I think are key to amplifying and increasing the scope and impact of chilling effects, including observation. That includes persistent forms like surveillance, modes of uncertainty, personalization. We see personally targeted forms of persecution. And those actors that have both power and authority. Those actors, when they wield this kind of power and they engage in these kinds of threats, have a greater chill and impact on victims. So one way in which science is so important is understanding impact, but also understanding the factors that go into the behavior itself and how it's mitigated, but also how it's aggravated and its scope is impacting. You can see actually the Trump administration, it understands chilling effects. You can see they maximize fear and uncertainty in the activities that they're doing. They're aiming for a chilling effect, and you can see them engaging in many of these factors to increase that scope. But where it becomes so important today is how science can be used to demonstrate chilling effects and to proving it in concrete ways. And that becomes important because, as we're seeing, in many cases, one of the key institutions, either of last resort, but in many ways only resort today, to constrain the activities of bad corporate actors or bad state actors that are engaging in activities to weaponize and to chill, is the court system. So that's where science becomes so important, is that going to court, you have to show a kind of industry. This is known as standing doctrine. So before you can actually launch a lawsuit and claim that some Trump administration action or some corporate activity or some other kind of activity has impacted on your rights and courts will accept your claim and you can litigate, you have to show standing. That is, you have to show a kind of an injury the courts accept is legitimate, it's cognizable. And the challenge there has been for chilling effects is that it's often, the way you can understand it, it's more abstract. Often the threat is more less concrete. At least in theory, I would argue in practice, it's actually far more concrete, and the science demonstrates this. But proving injury, and then once you get into court and your claim has been accepted to actually litigate by courts, demonstrating the effect of the state action in order to come up with a successful claim, that's where science becomes incredibly important. It's in this context where evidence has been successful. I would say that in the context of demonstrating chilling effects of certain vague laws, where evidence-based approaches have been successful, today the chill of a vague or overreaching law is a well-recognized First Amendment injury. And so therefore, it's easy to prove standing or easier to prove standing in these cases, although not always easy. But the courts have more often recognized this. An example of this, for example, is the chill of defamation law. There have been a number of studies over the year, both survey-based, litigation trend-based, that have attempted to demonstrate how defamation claims can have a chilling effect on certain kinds of speech. And that's been an area where the courts have accepted it. You see that in concrete ways in the US Supreme Court's famous decision in New York Times versus Sullivan, which hasn't been modified over the years, although there's some inkling that maybe courts want to revisit it, including the US Supreme Court. But the standard there, of course, is understood. The reasoning in that case understood that defamation law, libel laws can have a chilling effect, so that the standard that should be used should be a high bar to avoid the chilling effect where disfavored speech or speech that could be caught by defamation law, people would self-censor it. So you should have a high standard to avoid that effect. That's an area where I think science and evidence-based approaches has been more successful, where it's been far more of a struggle for those of us who believe in not just the existence, but the profound impact of chilling effects. It's demonstrating in the area, for example, of privacy-based chill or the chilling effects of surveillance. This is an area where courts, in particular the US Supreme Court, has been deeply, deeply skeptical. We see that in older cases dating back all the way to the 1970s, some of the earliest cases that look at questions of standing for surveillance claims that surveillance that targeted certain groups had a chilling effect on First Amendment activities. Courts have raised important barriers to these kinds of claims, and they've upheld those important thresholds and barriers today, such that you have recent cases where the US Supreme Court essentially discounted chilling effect claims in the context of privacy-based, surveillance-based claims as being examples of self-inflicted injury or being too subjective to be concrete enough to form a kind of cognizable injury that's sufficient for standing to successfully go to court and vindicate your rights. So privacy is one area. I would say another area in understanding the chilling effect of certain kinds of harassing and abusive speech, not just abusive, I would say abusive behavior, stalking behavior. This is another area that I think the court has struggled to balance and understand in light of other kinds of chilling effects that the court is more willing to recognize. And you see that in certain cases where courts will say we need more clear evidence of the impact of stalking and more evidence of abusive behavior, or in some cases simply ignore and discount it. So there are areas where I think the science is pretty clear and compelling about the impact of certain personal threats and stalking and harassment. And colleagues like Danielle Citron and Marianne Franks have done a lot of work in that area demonstrating those effects, but there's a disconnect between the court system and litigation and that evidence. I would say the same about the privacy area. You have important, compelling research like that done by Sarah, work that I've done, work that other social science researchers, work that Nathan has done, demonstrating the chilling effect of surveillance, of privacy-based threats, where the courts have been far more skeptical and less willing to accept that kind of evidence-based research. So let me stop there. I think I've laid the foundation for some of the further discussion there.
That's great, John. Thank you. Sarah, as John was saying, I know you've done a lot of work on surveillance and its impact on the choices that people make and the things they do or the things they avoid. Would you share that with us, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for those comments, John. It was so interesting as context. I was taking notes myself, which I don't think you're supposed to do when you're a presenter. Okay, let me just share my slides. Okay, can you see that? Okay, great. So as Katie mentioned, I'm a sociologist and I'm particularly interested in the criminal legal system. So I study everything from police contact through the courts to community supervision and incarceration. And so, although chilling effects, as John explained, sort of originates in the context of deterring things like free speech, freedom of expression, they're really not limited to that. And chilling effects can, I think, shape individuals' behaviors and their institutional interactions and their social participation more broadly. So today I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about how surveillance, how criminal justice surveillance specifically may chill individuals' participation in other important institutions. And in the spirit of this session, I will sort of talk about some of the challenges with empirically modeling some of this messy social behavior. So, as a bit of context, I have been volunteer teaching college classes in prisons for about 15 years. And over the years, my incarcerated students have understandably expressed, a lot of distrust of prison administration and corrections officers. What's really interesting to me, though, is that distrust or legal cynicism, as it's called in the literature, it extends far beyond the prison, far beyond the criminal justice system to a whole range of bureaucratic institutions, things like schools, the government broadly defined, and medical institutions. And so, about the same time that I started teaching in prisons and hearing this sentiment, there was some qualitative research emerging that suggested that people who were involved in the criminal legal system, they might be avoiding places like hospitals, emergency departments, maternity wards, out of fear that the police were surveilling these spaces and would identify and arrest them there. So, as a social scientist, I became really interested in trying to measure individuals' distrust of institutions and really quantify their efforts to evade them. So, in other words, I basically wanted to empirically use data to test whether there was indeed a chilling effect of criminal legal contact in other institutional domains. So I theorize this concept that I call system avoidance, which it's quite simple. It just means like the practice of people avoiding institutions that keep formal records or put them in the system, if you will, and therefore heighten their risk of surveillance and apprehension by authorities. I thought that John did an incredible job of emphasizing the important role of like uncertainty and perception here that it's almost immaterial if the cops are actually going to the emergency department and running people's names. It's this perception of surveillance that really drives individuals' behavior and their sort of behavioral adaptations. So I hypothesize that individuals who've had criminal justice contact, meaning they have been stopped by the police or they've been arrested, convicted, incarcerated, would be more likely to avoid institutions like medical institutions, financial institutions, labor market institutions, educational institutions. So to try and test for this relationship, I used data from two nationally representative longitudinal surveys, the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, more commonly known as AdHealth, and then the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, or NLSY 97. What's important is that each of these studies have followed thousands of people over time, repeatedly surveying them from adolescence into adulthood. So it's not just like a snapshot of individuals at one point in time. They are collecting data on them and administering these surveys at multiple points throughout their lives. So to statistically model system avoidance, I use three types of models. They're relatively simple: logistic regressions, propensity score matching, and individual level fixed effects. I'll talk about them just in the context of the results so that you can have an idea of what some of the challenges around using observational data to test for a behavior might be. So in this logistic regression model, like I've just circled sort of one thing you could look at. I predict institutional involvement by criminal justice contact. So I estimate two different models for all of the different institutional outcomes. The institutional outcomes you can see at the top. So the question on the survey, for example, for medical care is, have you avoided obtaining medical care when you thought you needed it, right? We have outcomes for if you have a bank account, school or work. And then I distinguish between what I call surveilling institutions and non-surveilling institutions, meaning, of course, like some civic groups and religious organizations do conduct surveillance. Sometimes you need to register for certain events and things, but you can generally participate in these institutions and opt out of the more intrusive forms of record keeping. Like if you just want to go to church, hop in, hop out, you can sort of do that. Similarly, you want to go and attend a protest, you don't have to necessarily register with your ID, for example. Whereas to get a bank account, to obtain medical care, formal employment, and school, there's a lot more surveillance associated with it. So what these models say is here, if we look at model 6 on the far left, what this says is that people with criminal justice contact have 30% higher odds of reporting avoiding obtaining medical care when they thought they needed it. Then I sort of break it down into different levels of criminal justice contact. But as you can see, there seems to be the stars mean statistical significance. So there seems to be a statistically significant relationship between criminal justice contact and participation in surveilling institutions. And there doesn't seem to be a relationship with non-surveilling institutions. I should note that at the bottom, all of these controls, this relationship is net of a whole bunch of socio-demographic and behavioral controls. So things like race, age, sex, behavioral things like do you carry a weapon around? Have you committed crimes? Have you used drugs? Because of course we can expect that those things would both predict criminal justice contact and institutional involvement. So the next strategy, which is called propensity score matching, and then there's an associated thing called doubly robust estimation. Essentially, all this is we can't randomly assign criminal justice contact, right? And so you can imagine that people who are involved in the criminal justice system, people who have been arrested, spent time in prison, may be different. They may vary along systematic axes from those who don't have criminal justice contact. So then the concern there as scientists and as researchers is that the underlying features or characteristics of people, and I don't even necessarily mean those in like static, innate characteristic ways, like the neighborhoods you grow up in, this type of thing, that those might be what is driving criminal justice contact and institutional avoidance rather than the treatment effect, if you will, of criminal justice contact itself. And so all this propensity score matching strategy does is it does a little bit of a better job of like comparing like with like. So a better counterfactual where it says, okay, I'm going to match these people on a whole bunch of different observable characteristics, but the only difference between them is that some of them have criminal justice contact and some of them don't. And then you sort of run the analysis in that way. So last sort of like statistics lesson here, I apologize for a lot of people, understandably, particularly if there are economists in the audience, they might still be skeptical, being like, okay, yeah, she's controlling for a whole bunch of different things. She does these non-parametric estimation methods. But like, how can she really know that it's criminal justice contact as opposed to some underlying characteristics of individuals that's making them less likely to avoid surveilling institutions? How do we know there's actually a chilling effect here, that it's like there's a chilling effect of criminal justice contact rather than these individuals are just sort of sketched out around institutions more generally? So let me offer sort of one last technique. This is really exploiting the longitudinal nature of the data. So again, like that we are able to have observations about people at different points in time. So this analysis focuses only on individuals who have change in the independent and dependent variable over time, meaning people go from having no criminal justice contact in one wave of the survey to having criminal justice contact in the next wave of the survey. Similarly, they go from not reporting, avoiding obtaining medical care when they thought they needed it in one wave of the survey, to reporting, avoiding obtaining medical care when they thought they needed it in the next wave of the survey. So in my mind, this would be sort of like, although it's a very select sample, the most conservative way of testing or estimating for a true effect. And here, indeed, you find that, folks who go from not having criminal justice contact in wave 3 of the survey to having criminal justice in wave 4 of the survey have about 48% higher odds of reporting, avoiding obtaining medical care when they thought they needed it. So sociologists are really interested in social inequality, and I think that there are some important implications of system avoidance and chilling effects more generally for social inequality that I just wanted to highlight as I wrap up here. The cumulative risk of imprisonment and criminal justice contact more generally is highly unequal, particularly along race and class lines, right? 1 in 3 Black men born in like about 2000, 2001 have a cumulative risk of imprisonment in their life course compared to like 1 in 17 white men. If you look at just Black men who have not completed high school, they have about 60% cumulative risk or lifetime risk of spending time in prison. So it's more likely than not that they won't, whereas it's about 11% for white men who have not completed high school in that same cohort. So, what that means is that any negative consequences of system avoidance are going to be similarly disproportionately distributed or unequally distributed throughout the population. So, and there certainly are negative consequences, right? These are quite basic. Failing to obtain medical care, of course, can negatively affect future health outcomes, as regular medical care is associated with, early detection of diseases and health conditions. It's associated with much lower rates of morbidity and mortality. Not having a bank account, being unbanked, this can preclude individuals from things like building credit, securing financing for investments that could lead to upward economic mobility. I probably don't need to spend time explaining why going to school or having a job might be important. But I think that what this highlights is that system avoidance might be a mechanism through which criminal justice system contact might exacerbate pre-existing inequalities for an already quite structurally disadvantaged group of individuals. And this group is not even that select in the sense that in the United States, our surveillance apparatus is so huge, our criminal justice system is so overgrown, that 1 in 3 adults, like upwards of 50 million people in the US, have a criminal record on file. Like, this is not sort of a rare occurrence, even necessarily. And so I'll just end here by saying that although the focus of this study and my research is really on the criminal legal system, I think that system avoidance might be relevant across a pretty wide range of institutional domains. So, since publishing this work, scholars have since published work testing system avoidance in other contexts, like immigration. There's a scholar named Assad who has a great book called Engage and Evade. He sort of complicates system avoidance, and that, yeah, there is some avoidance, but then there's some selective engagement. There's work on emergency medicine, child protective services, public assistance or social service utilization, and parental involvement in education. So, with that, I will end and stop sharing my slides, but I just want to thank you again, Katie and Nathan and John, for inviting me to be a part of this, and I'm happy to have a broader conversation after. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. That was so interesting. I didn't even know that those longitudinal surveys existed. I think that's one thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of
Those of
problems
us
with
who
them. Yeah.
aren't scientists don't even know like what data sources are necessarily available that may be, really commonly used. So thank you for sharing that. Nathan, why don't you tell us about your work on chilling effects and a little bit about your new project?
Thanks, Katie. So I'm here to ask a question, basic question. How can scientists actually inform the law and support basic rights? And I want to open up with a story. So last January, when leaders of a large immigrant church in Boston stood in front of their congregation, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The sanctuary that's usually filled had less than half of the usual number. It wasn't just that it wasn't just that church. Dozens of groups, including many denominations, noticed reductions in Sunday attendance, soup kitchens, homeless shelters after the Department of Homeland Security opened the door to raids on churches, schools, and hospitals. Leaders believed there was a chilling effect, that fear of ICE enforcement made people afraid to show up, exactly what Sarah was describing. So they joined a lawsuit claiming that the policy violates the First Amendment and religious freedom laws. Then in April, when a judge reviewed their request for immediate action, she argued the churches couldn't prove causality and denied the request. Now, the case is ongoing, but if the chilling effect is real, and if the judge had been convinced in April, churches might have been more protected throughout this year, and we wouldn't have communities worried about the impact of hard to substantiate rumors of potential Christmas raids on churches later this month. It's a very real thing that people are trying to make sense of right now. And this story is emblematic of a wider need that countless civil liberties lawyers have told us. Legal cases on freedom of expression, religion, assembly, and other basic rights sometimes get hung up without the same kind of support of scientific experts that are common in other fields like voting rights or reproductive rights or environmental harms. So a group of us, including Katie, John, and others, have been asking, what can scientists do? And there are two answers I want to offer to you. One is that we should work on the science of civil liberties, and the second is that we should show up as experts in these cases. So first, what does the science of civil liberties look like? You've already heard Sarah present some of her work and John. And I should note that as a scientist, my first commitment is to the truth, right? If something doesn't cause a chilling effect, I want to know just as much as I want to know about consequential chilling effects in the world. John and I recently published an article about science and causality and technology litigation that outlines over a dozen key scientific concepts. I will not bore you all with all of them, but as I share a couple of examples, I want to highlight two concepts that are relevant to the science of chilling effects, reverse causality and forward causality. So when someone does something in the world and you want to know what its effect was, that's reverse causality. So John talked about his work on chilling effects from public knowledge of state surveillance. He analyzed historical data, used a clear outcome variable that represented behavior that's protected under the Constitution, and used statistics to estimate changes in that behavior that could be attributed to government actions. Reverse causality tells a really powerful story. People were exposed to a potential chill, they experienced an effect, and that effect is visible in observed behavior on average. And Sarah's paper on system avoidance is also a really elegant example of that kind of reverse causality through observational research means. And at our lab, Cat Lab, we do some studies like that. We also work on forward causality, running experiments to find out what in general causes chilling effects, and equally importantly, what we can do to reduce and mitigate them. So here are a couple of examples. A few years ago, we did a study on the effects of organized intimidation on people's right to assemble freely with others. We worked with an online feminist community that routinely experiences what are called hate raids, where people would flood their spaces, spreading intimidation, making the experience unpleasant, and dissuading newcomers from ever returning. Now, as we've heard, one part of chilling effect theory is that uncertainty about risks chills people's uptake of their rights. So we worked with the group to develop an intervention that reduced people's uncertainty about the risks of these hate raids. And we were able to increase community participation by 20% on average, an effect that durably persisted for months. And by doing this, we were able to do two things. First, we showed the effect of hate raids on assembly by trying to reduce them and target that particular issue. And we also showed how to reduce, though not entirely remove, the effect. Here's another example. In 2016, we did an experiment with a 13 million subscriber science discussion group to test ideas for preventing online harassment while trying to minimize any chilling effects from those efforts. Many people believe that content moderation chills free speech, and sometimes it does. But online hate and violence are also real problems that restrict people's speech through intimidation. So we developed a randomized trial that posted clear, unambiguous policies against harassment and measured the effect on rates of harassment and also on participation levels in the community. We found, in line with some of the predictions from survey research by John and Danielle Citron, that clear policies against harassment both prevent harassment and increase participation by newcomers, kind of the opposite of a chilling effect. And we're now writing up a meta-analysis of 6 other studies that have largely found the same thing. So I hope these 2 examples show the value of going into science with an open mind. You won't always find a chilling effect. And they also show the value of forward causality. And if you take one thing away from this talk, I want it to be this, right? Experiments won't necessarily answer who did what to whom in the past, but they build out basic science that helps both scientists be able to explain and theorize how this all happens, and hopefully can help courts gain clarity on the nature of chilling effects, while importantly also giving us tools for protecting people and communities in the meantime, whether or not courts are persuaded in any individual case. So experiments give us those practical tools we can use even as we're trying to inform courts. And that brings us to the second thing scientists can do. In addition to convincing funders in our field to invest in the science of civil liberties, we also need to show up in the courts, even if that's new for some of us. When courts have scientific questions, they turn to scientific experts, whether through briefs that we file independently or through scientists actually serving as expert witnesses on one side or other of a case. Over the last few months, a group of us have been building a project we called STAND, the Science and Technology Advisors Network for Civil Liberties Defense. This project will connect scientists with litigators where scientific expertise or data analysis could help inform courts. In the last few months, we've already connected multiple cases with scientists. We've started to assemble the needed legal and organizational structures to do this more regularly, and we started our fundraising and institutional building pieces. And in the short term, we want to source experts for cases that urgently need them. And in the longer time, we also want to grow the number of scientists working on these civil liberties questions so we can build up the body of evidence that makes it possible for courts to make sense of an ever unfolding set of questions about the role of technology, the role of new government actions on basic rights, so that when there are these empirical questions like there were in this court in April, judges and the rest of the legal system have access to reliable knowledge about what's actually happening, what the real effects are, so that we can take action at appropriate times to protect fundamental rights.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. As you know, I'm very excited about the STAND initiative and looking forward to sharing more information about that as it grows. Okay, so we have, a little over 10 minutes left, and I think the question I want to open with for all of you to take in whatever direction you want is, what does it mean for scientists to do science in the service of civil liberties? So, to paint with a really broad brush, litigators want to win, and scientists want to know the answer. So how do those things interact, and sort of what does that mean for you? Anybody? John, you want to start?
Sure, happy to. So thanks, Katie. That's a really great question. And I guess from my perspective, something that I think about this sometimes as a lawyer, sometimes as a social scientist, it's difficult because, as you say, there's a clear tension there, right? The legal process is an adversarial one where you have often experts on both sides of a particular legal question. And underlying that legal question, you have research questions that scientists like Nathan and Sarah construct really complicated, elaborate, and sophisticated studies to answer, right? And social science has its own norms, has its own disciplinary boundaries and rules about what is good science, what it means to do good science. And often from a lawyer's perspective, what might be good social science, good scientific practice is not so helpful, right? And I think going back to Nathan's, one of the points he made, as a scientist, he's interested in the truth, getting at the most accurate answer, whether there's a chilling effect or not, right? And so a lawyer might be saying, I don't want to hear about, I want to demonstrate a particular claim. I want to show there's a chilling effect. And so show me how to get there. And I think the answer is in both the work of Sarah and Nathan, to the extent that the best way, I think, for chilling effect, litigation, and the science of it to be operationalized and used by lawyers who are litigating these cases is that there has to be people like Nathan, like Sarah, like myself, and like you, Katie, and the Knight First Amendment is to try to bridge those different institutional and field norms, right? Lawyers have to understand that the best kinds of studies and the best kinds of science is not necessarily going to be the kind that is always going to be the most compelling and helpful within the courtroom. But in order to demonstrate chilling effects, you want to have robust science that can stand up to the kinds of critiques, methodological critiques that an expert on the other side of that litigation coin, or the other side in the adversarial process, are going to be questioning, are going to be criticizing. So for me, the way to reconcile that is for lawyers to understand that scientific inquiries can take us in different directions, but understanding norms on both sides is, I think, the first step to successful science within the legal concept. But it's a challenge, of course, and you need people with expertise, unfortunately, on both sides of it.
Great. Sarah and Nathan, anything you want to add to that?
Go ahead, Nathan. I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. I think there are a few, pieces to this depending on the state of scientific knowledge, right? There are some areas where we have a lot of evidence and a lot of consensus, and it's on us as scientists to do this work so that like lawyers aren't facing a sea of uncertainty, but we've actually done the science to answer the questions. And so when we talk about this broader work of building out the scientific field, building out the case, making this a thing that scientists routinely look at, that helps us build the like foundation of scientific evidence that then can be taken into legal context with confidence. But sometimes there's a really important question and it's hard to get at an answer outside of the legal process itself. And I know the law has systems of discovery that allow the court to compel various parties to make evidence available to answer a very, very important question. And so I think we also need scientists who are willing to go into a legal case with a commitment to the truth and also a commitment to supporting analysis of new evidence that comes out as part of the discovery process. And so not everyone is going to have a comfort level to dive in and serve as an expert witness in a way that involves all of the infrastructure of being part of a case on a particular side. But that's a profoundly important role to play as well.
That's great. I completely agree with what the other panelists have mentioned so far, and I'll just briefly mention two additional things. The first is that I think that scientists are often not trained in how to do translational work, right? Like how to actually communicate their findings in a way that is palatable to lay audiences, that's palatable to legal audiences, that's, that type of thing. And so I do think that that is something that when we are thinking about scientific training, something that might be important. The other thing I just wanted to mention is like the actual selection of research questions themselves and how I just want to make a pitch that it is so, so, so important to have independent basic science here. Katie, you mentioned funding a little bit. Like the incentives can get all perverse if the research questions that scientists are paid to ask and paid to answer are funded by those who have vested interest in a very particular answer. So I do think it's really important to continue to have independent basic science. And also that scientists are transparent about the uncertainty in their findings. That is something that's like really difficult in the legal context, right? Like social scientists can't even really prove anything. We can just like disprove stuff. So when you start to talk about uncertainty, that's like incredibly undesirable to lawyers. I totally understand that. But I think that that's potentially where some of the training about communicating the limits of what we know and what we don't know can come into play.
Yeah, no, I think those are all good points. I mean, in terms of the sort of understanding when and where there is scientific consensus is definitely something that I know lawyers struggle with, including myself. And I think just having lines of communication open where you can talk to a social scientist and even just say, like, I have this one study that I read that says this, and then I have this other study that I read that says that. How do I understand these? How do I put them into conversation with each other in like the broader context? That might feel very overwhelming for a litigator, but it doesn't have to be if you know that you can call someone and they'll put you in touch with somebody who can walk you through it the way that you all did with your research now. So there's an audience question that I want to get to. This person says, I appreciated Professor Matias's point that social scientists can serve as expert witnesses by speaking to causal mechanisms of chilling effects. But there's a tension where rigorous causal identification often takes time, litigation moves fast, and novel forms of chill deployed today may lack the established empirical record and historical patterns needed for a clean causally identified study. How should social scientists reconcile those competing needs? And to throw that to the social scientists, I will just note, Litigation, like from start to finish, doesn't always move fast. It can actually move unbelievably slowly. But this sort of like the starting line point where you have what you need to get through the courthouse door to show standing, like John was saying, that is often the real dilemma, is there's this bad thing happening in real time and you're trying to challenge it in court. But if you don't have evidence, that can be quite challenging.
John, do you want to start as the person who is both a lawyer and a scientist?
Sure. No problem. So on this, and this is, coming back to maybe part of this conversation from the first webinar and something that I talk about in the book. I mean, one of the existing challenges to bridging, law and the science of chilling effects is the fact that today, the way the doctrine, the way the law treats these kinds of claims, treats them so skeptically, has created highly technical rules, highly technical doctrines like standing that makes it really difficult to be able to go to court and at least provide an evidence base or provide evidence and a full sort of hearing for the claims and the impacts on victims in a way that a trier of fact, whether a judge or a jury, might eventually hear them. Instead, we have doctrine that's very technical, makes it so difficult. So on the one hand, what I would say is there has to be change on both sides, right? I think on the one hand, coming back to the importance of Sarah mentioned about communication, when Nathan had talked about scientists being willing to go to the courtroom and to communicate their findings in a compelling way to promote that kind of understanding. But I do think there also has to be better understanding on the legal side of things. Judges' skepticism right now for privacy-based surveillance claims. I think there was a time where that kind of skepticism was more justified, but I think today the evidence is far more compelling. And we're getting to the point where I think we're spilling over to say there's no longer whether there's an existence of this kind of chilling effect. Clearly there is. In individual cases, the question is how far is the scope? How deep is the impact? And on how many people are affected by it within society? And how is this group affected by it? How is it impacted? And I think there needs to be more recognition on the legal side, both among lawyers, but in particular judges, of being more open to greater insight investigation of the kinds of evidence that's out there. And part of, maybe this is coming back to your first question, Katie, is to thinking about how lawyers can build interdisciplinary teams. And that means not just bringing in experts to go to court and provide studies and evidence, but also thinking through interdisciplinary teams within law firms. So if you're addressing a kind of claim that you know is going to end up in a scientific context, it's great to have somebody right there. You can ask some of those questions about what does this finding mean in this existing study? How do we translate this kind of scientific language over to a litigation context, and having a social scientist there with that kind of communication, that kind of understanding that can provide quick answers. I think that makes a lot of sense going forward and can help lawyers doing the litigation helping. But I think judicial education is the other side of this, to understand there's a lot of evidence out there and the skepticism really isn't warranted in these kinds of contexts. So I think that's one part of the answer. The other side that I would say is we need shifts in the law. One of the things I argue in the book is there is an acknowledgement in some cases where the court says we have doctrines that's going to make it easier for people to go to court. You can bring a kind of claim where, in theory, the person who has been chilled, they've not come to court. So sometimes we have exceptions to standing doctrine that allows you to make a claim for a hypothetical third party. But that's only been acknowledged in the context of laws, overreaching laws, not in the context of surveillance, for example, or privacy-based claims. I think that kind of doctrine needs to be expanded to make it less technical and easier to make out these claims. So that's a role for judges, for lawyers to make that kind of argument, to make it easier for scientists to be able to bring their evidence to court.
Great. Nathan, anything you'd like to add in our final minute?
Yeah, very briefly, this is where we can learn from other fields, right? Let's say someone's been, think about environmental toxicology. Let's say you've been exposed to asbestos, right? At this point, we know asbestos has certain harms, right? And so you do not have to prove in every new asbestos case that asbestos is harmful, right? And I think that's where we want to focus on the basic science so we can make general claims about like the causes of chilling effects in general. And then we reduce the nature of the claims in a given case to like, were you exposed to one of those kinds of things? This is vastly oversimplifying, but there are ways that we can link up different kinds of studies that allow us to build the broader evidence base and enable courts to move quickly, just like we have done with so many other fields. And hopefully, if we build up an ecosystem of folks doing the science of civil liberties, over time, that'll be faster and faster and more efficient and more reliable.
Terrific. Okay, well, we are at time. This has been a really great conversation. I learned a lot, even as the moderator. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here with us and sharing your work. I hope there will be more to share in terms of collaboration going forward. And thanks to those of you in the audience who are listening. Please consider going to our website, knightcolumbia.org, and signing up for our newsletter if you want to find out about future events and work associated with this conversation. Thanks all. Thank you for being here. Have a good rest of your day.